I am Mark Vernon, very glad today to be talking with Martin Shaw. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Mark. Nice to see you.
Now, Martin, you are very well known as a mythologist. I am a psychotherapist and someone very interested in inner life more generally. And let me just put a big proposition to you to kind of like take the plunge into this area, which was recently put to me actually, that someone said that we're very good at the imagination in the modern world, particularly in terms of fantasy. You know, just think of the film industry, or you think of the sci-fi books that sell. Actually, imagination is all around us. But there's a difference between imagining and the imaginal. And by that, they mean this distinction that the imaginal is actually a world that carries truth. And if we can tap into it, the imaginal can speak to us rather than just being this production of our inner lives as if they live in sort of splendid isolation in an otherwise meaningless cosmos. And it occurred to me that in your work with true myth, you're tapping into the imaginal, not just forms of imaginative, fantastical entertainment, which is why, as a mythologist, it's transformative. So I just wonder whether that makes some sense to you as a kind of a starting point for our conversation.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, that does chime. I mean, of course, as soon as I hear the word imaginal, I'm thinking of Omri Korban, the Islamic theologian, and his rather dry but terribly important essay, the Mundus Imaginalis, that came out, I think, initially in the early 60s, but it's been a kind of hardy perennial for a lot of people for a long time. Huge influence on James Hillman, for example. And actually, as time went on, Korban became growingly more uncomfortable with people like you and I, unless you are actually an Islamic philosopher in disguise, I don't know, but I'm not. He said, look, when I'm talking about imaginal, it has an Islamic cosmology attached to it. So he used to get, towards the end of his life, he got a bit hot under the collar with Hillman about that, because Hillman took that word and really expanded it. I suppose the distinction that you make immediately really is between, I think of as fantasy and imagination. And then the imaginal is this wider proposition where we move almost into a sort of an animistic, aboriginal, across species, as it were, kind of communication. Now, my long background in wilderness rites of passage, going out into the wild and sitting for 4 days and nights, is almost inevitably going to take you into that terrain, but it's going to do it very slowly, rather than gobbling on a visionary vine and finding yourself there in 5 minutes. 4 days is a sufficiently slow move into a different kind of consciousness that connects you to a very deep, old root system that human beings seem to have understood from the Lascaux caves and back. I think there's a huge difference actually between myth and fantasy, and people probably at this point are expecting me to dismiss fantasy, and I wouldn't do that. Fantasy books can save your life when you're 12, but myth intrinsically means no author. So rather than a kid in Hoxton hunched over a laptop, inspired though they can be, myth has something always to do with the oral tradition. It always has something to do, which is something to do with a kind of patterning of energy that's passed from community to community to community and mouth to mouth to mouth. And then finally, when it hits a literary stream, it doesn't necessarily lose its power, but it changes. Yeah, that's my opening thought anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, you made me think that, excuse me, the thing that the 12-year-old has is that they haven't lost touch with the imaginal. So fantasy is access to that wider world, because they know that it contains truths that if they can relate to and imagine themselves into, it will be transformative. They're still very much in the developmental phase. they haven't bought into this idea that it stops when you're about 18. And so I guess that's why. And then fantasy books can save us when we have a crisis too, because again, we know we need more, and so might turn and look.
Do you remember that phrase, religion is a defense against a religious experience?
I don't actually.
I mean, of course,
Brilliant.
Luckily, it's not always the case. It's not always the case, but we all know when that can happen. So in other words, you have the encounter, and then you have the theory that gradually encases the encounter until all you're left with is a facsimile or a photocopy or a memory of it. But what you're describing with this imaginary 12-year-old, they're just connected to the encounter. So they haven't yet been, the thing hasn't yet been corralled. They have hopefully they have an untrammeled imagination. But I'm interested in this thought that so that's how you see modernity. You see us as surrounded by imagination all day long, filled with innovation and, good things.
Well, it may or may not be good things. I mean, I think that the point is you can't put the human imagination down. And it takes many forms, of course. I mean, sometimes it's very skillfully created into something that, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that is expansive, that includes judgment in the sense of discernment, but isn't moralistic. Those wonderful tales, which are modern as well as ancient. But I think that the problem that we have in the modern world is that we've forgotten how to engage with this imagination. I mean, it was flagged up by the Romantics, Coleridge's famous remark that there's a kind of fantasy which you can enjoy, but it doesn't go anywhere. The trick is to discern an imaginative journey when you think this is really taking me somewhere. I'm stepping into worlds I didn't even know existed, and yet they're amplifying and expanding my sense of what's possible in life. I mean, maybe I can link it to another thing that I think that modernity can get wrong, or just sort of forget actually, is that power, say, has many, many different meanings. And I think that nowadays we tend to think of power as my agency. It's a bit like freedom being my ability to express my will. And look, there's something in that. There's no doubt about that, the valuing of the individual and what they've got to contribute. But the worry is that it becomes so dominant and such a kind of crucial moral concern that it overlooks other kinds of power. And I see this in what you do. I mean, one is the power of beauty, which I sometimes think of as grace and space power. It opens us up. And the thing about beauty, which was recognized by the philosophers, ancient and modern, is that beauty can be manifest tangibly in our world. And we might discuss and dispute what is beautiful, but that there are beautiful things few people would deny, or if they did deny it, we'd think they were in a bad state. But nonetheless, it draws us into more than ourselves. That's why it's so powerful. So that's one kind of power, which actually is more like an allure or an attractor than my exertion of my agency. But then another one, which I guess is very familiar to you with the rites of passage, is the kind of power that emerges from holding attention. So rather than, say, resolving the desire to be safe and the feeling of being at risk in some way, if you can find a way to hold that tension, then that itself has a kind of power that again will potentially at least pivot or precipitate you into something that you didn't know was possible or you could feel before. So, that kind of power of tension, but then also the power of being drawn rather than just me forcing myself onto the world. They seem like really crucial notions of power that get lost.
Yes, that's really well put. I have a school that's almost 20 years old that began a long time ago when I was living in a black tent on a succession of English hills. And I had 3 students. And something I've noticed over the years, with now usually most years, anything up to about 60 students come, they're in the initial weekend, often what you hear coming out of them energetically would be the phrase, I want to be heard. I want to be heard. Agency is everything. and myth's going to help me do that. But by the end of the year, if I've done my work sufficiently, the question is, how do I speak? And so there's been a considerable dialing down of hubris as you realize that actually power, in the way I understand it, is always in service. Power without service is mad. And it's always difficult, as you know well, as soon as you're trying to align a spiritual tradition to a position of power in the world, crazy and unpleasant things tend to happen fairly quickly. It's a big conversation, I know. Something else that struck me as you were speaking was that at the moment there's a revival in literature of myth. There are millions and millions of young people reading books like Circe, Madeline Miller's very popular Greek myths. So I'm thinking of, and of course, Neil Gaiman, Stephen Fry. Now, here's the big thing that's happened. These are all being written in the first person, not the third. So in other words, the way I work, I would never dream of orally telling a story from as if I was inside Aphrodite, because in some way that very intimacy would rob me of some kind of essential distance I need for the myth itself to radiate out towards me. I need to be in a now, what is that word? Phenomenological relationship. It needs to radiate something towards me. But the way that we are consuming myth more and more at the moment, and I don't know whether it's a good or a bad thing, but it's a thing, is through the first person, because that's so in tune with the issues of today, which is about being seen, being heard, certain things announcing themselves, and people are using myths and stories to do it. But it didn't used to be that way. It's something that's very much about now.
I love that difference. I hadn't spotted that, and I think I agree with you. It's hugely significant, because in a way, maybe apart from anything else, what it says is that we can't really trust the inner life of the world as a whole, and the inner life of the cosmos. We can only trust our own inner lives, and so we have only to speak in the I or the me, the first person. And it reminds, I was actually recently talking to the artist Xiaolu Guo, who's Chinese artist living here in London, and we were talking about Taoism, and she made the observation that in classical Chinese, until really quite recently, even I think if I've got this right, the point of the Cultural Revolution under communist China, there weren't really words for I and me in Chinese as we use them. You could sort of point to someone as an individual, but you would say the human person, as it were, rather than fully acknowledging the I with all the resonance that means for us in the West. But this then led to a further conversation, because I think there's something important about Christianity in all this, and something that's got lost in Christianity in all this, because I've been persuaded by Owen Barfield, one of the Inklings, great friends with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, hugely brilliant myth writers, of course. And what Barfield said to his friends was that Christianity is pivotal in the emergence of the Western I, and because what it said was that the individual person can resonate fully with all things within themselves. This is the kind of significance of the figure of Jesus that people saw, reflected upon, and then began to work out what it means that the one individual can resonate with the one God, and so know within themselves a kind of microcosm that reflects the macrocosm. And the argument is this is very different from a polytheistic culture where everything is collective, everything is shared. And so, for example, to know a particular God, you might have to go to a particular place, tell the special story, invoke it with others in an oral tradition. Now, inner life is seen as the kind of locus of revelation. But, and this is the kind of further twist that Barfield pointed out, that individuality as a portal into the all can easily collapse into individuality being the only thing that's important. And so actually, as an access point into all things, it gets lost, particularly when we lose the sense that there might be the divine, there might be deities, there might be enchantment round and about us, that we, with our individuality, are actually free to explore, freer to explore, perhaps even in some ways than ancient peoples. But putting that to one side, I think something's gone wrong with Christianity. And you, I mean, you mentioned religion, which is a heavy word for many people. And you need, where are you at on all that? Let me ask a bit of a leading question, because I know you're at somewhere on it.
Yeah. Well, it's I'm at a very interesting moment. I'm 50. I used to be taken to church by my dad and my mum, and I would hear stories of this strange Middle Eastern religion. There was a phenomenal emphasis on belief, you know, which is an odd thing for a 5-year-old to try and absorb, because, as I've said before, when I was 5, I didn't believe in anything all day long. I didn't even believe I was a boy all day long. Sometimes I thought I was a heron. Sometimes I thought I was a streak of lightning. Other times I thought I was, you know, Gilgamesh. But what would happen, you see, is we'd go to church, and on the way back, with the pressure off, my dad, apropos of nothing, would tell me folk tales. And with no pressure to believe them in the way I believe in my electricity bill, they went deeper. And so, to be honest with you, by the time I got to about 17, I was really ready to leave Christianity behind, because I had experienced a very particular evangelical thrust of it, that by that point, as a child, that is, as a human actually, that is just wired for mystery. And that's not, and a mystery is not the same thing as as a secret. I've been thinking about that today. A mystery is not a secret. A secret is something that's being concealed from you, but Jesus is not a secret. He's a mystery trying to announce himself, I think. But I also felt as a kid, Jesus was too tall an order. I couldn't approach it. You know, I'd go blind if I looked too direct. I never identified with Jesus at all. I was always, unfortunately, like my middle name, I was more of a Peter, of a cock crowing, denying type. But what's happened extraordinarily for me at 50 is I've re-entered profoundly the deep kernel of Christianity that I abandoned as a child. And irony of ironies, it began by going out on a 101-day vigil about 2 years ago, just before COVID actually, where I just went to a Dartmoor wood to sit at twilight for a couple of hours and give thanks. Now, as a long-term wilderness rites of passage guide, as someone that lived in a tent for 4 years, as someone that has walked away from a lot of what modernity seems to offer, I promise you, Mark, the last thing that I expected in any conceivable shape and form was at the depth of that ritual, I would re-encounter the mossy face of Christ. But I did. And I was left in a rather Blakean way with these words emblazoned: inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. It's an odd phrase. Inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. So I sat with that for a while, because I knew, and this is going to lead back into what we're talking about, I knew that for me, my sense of an original home, of course, was the mythopoetic dream of Eden. And of course, as a storyteller, I must confess that I've always felt it fairly essential for the human experiment that we left Eden. I've always been, to some degree, a fan of the fall. You know, I don't think you make great art in Eden. You make great art thinking about Eden, whilst, you know, viewing it from a distance. Again, you know, a lot of my friends would disagree with that, but that's how I've experienced it. So we hear a lot at the moment about people saying modernity, we have a God-shaped hole. I would say probably we have a myth-shaped hole. A man I spoke to yesterday said we have a community-shaped hole. one way or another, we certainly have a meaning-shaped hole. Now, Joseph Campbell got a lot of applause for saying human beings they're not really looking for meaning at all. They're looking for experience. He's wrong. He's wrong. We are, and I love Joseph Campbell, but we are meaning-making human beings. We absolutely do it. As we get older, our narratives get less clear because we see how complex life is. As a mythologist, it's hard for me to hold on to the typical redemptive art of a myth in my own life because I've seen so much fall away. But I believe in moments within those stories, but they just come in a strange order. So I never thought that I would be re-inhabiting Christianity in any way because I found it so unfulfilling and so domestic and so lacking in protein. But I have to tell you, in my own personal experience, and we can talk about it later if you want, I was wrong. And I think whilst Christianity has taken trajectories, for example, for me, the emphasis of belief, which I understand, but sometimes not so good, especially with the evangelical movement, not so good for artists. What would they have done with Blake? What on earth would they have done with Blake? And what an impoverished world it would have been if Blake had taken that memo and just been quiet.
Hey, look, I've got to wind you back a bit because I imagine there'll be listeners like me who want to know what the Mossy Face of Christ looked like. What actually happened then?
I'll tell you. So it's the end of 101 days. And I'm going to do a night vigil up in a Dartmoor forest where there's a Celtic hill fort. And by this point, I think these days, when people talk about ritual and ceremony, they place their emotional life in the center of it. So as long as I keep feeling groovy about this, I'll continue to do it. But then my inner knowing tells me to stop. The reason I did this for 101 days is that I knew after about 20 days, I'd want to wrap this puppy up and get back to my life. And so I thought, well, let's go full on Desert Father with this and let's stick it out and let's entertain the possibility that my emotional state is not the great barometer of truth in this situation. I'm just going to keep going out and keep listening. It was a time, as we're in now, where there was a lot of attention on climate emergency. It was exactly the time that everything was going on with Extinction Rebellion in Trafalgar Square. It was that moment. So on the last night, I go out into the forest and I'm just glad it's almost done. I haven't been fasting. I'm in no form of visionary state, nothing like that. I go up, I've had a cup of tea, I've had a meal, I'm fine. I go up into the woods, it's pitch black. And for some reason, it's about 2 o'clock in the morning, it's very cold, it's about -3. I decided to do something I don't normally do, which is rather than look at the forest around me, which I know very well, I looked up into the sky and I saw sort of coming down from the sky. I know this sounds odd, but, and I don't really know I don't know quite what happened next, other than it's significant because of the ritual shape it occurred in. I saw a stream of colors like the aurora borealis, those kind of wonderful greens and whites and purples, and they just shot out of the sky and landed about 10 foot away to my right. They just sort of flopped into the forest. It was properly Old Testament. It was utterly silent, weirdly. There was no noise. It just happened. And it was, if you're a wilderness rites of passage guide, I don't discount for a second that could be some sort of just natural phenomena that I happen to see. But when it happens within a particular ceremony where you are exclusively looking for vision and information, you take it seriously. You take it seriously. So it was coming down from the hill the next day that, as I was actually getting into bed from that experience, I saw these 9 words. So I was left both with this sort of, it was like an arrow of color just falling out of the sky into the woods, and then these words, and then uneasily sitting with the reality, I can't explain it really, that I started to dream about Jesus. Sometimes he would appear as a stag. Sometimes he would appear in a kind of light form. And once, and most significantly, he appeared, I had a dream that I was in the trenches and it was the First World War. And I was a soldier, and there was this older captain. And he said, your arm is damaged. And I looked, and sure enough, I had no idea, but in the dream, I had this arm that could just about function, but it was clearly mangled, and I tried to fix it myself. And in the dream, he said, I'm going to make your arm well again, but to do it, I'm going to have to break it again. And in the dream, my arm was broken again and fixed. So once that kind of thing starts dropping, once that kind of imaginal starts dropping into your life regularly, you would be foolish to discount it, because it's really what we all live for. It's a contact with it, it's contact with a source of energy that I think is actually at its depth outside of just our little body and our concerns. I do like the notion of an indwelling presence of, the kingdom of God is inside us. But when you contact that, one of the ways you've contacted it is that there's also something, it's as near as your own breath, but it's also this being that's connected to the thing that brought the whole universe into play. I'll finish in a minute, but I'll say one thing that's just occurring to me is, I suppose as a mythologist, I remain absolutely in love with the myths of this world that tell us about the earth, the divine influxes that pour through human beings. They tell me everything about the motivations and the passions that we all experience that are visible and invisible. But in terms of how to actually navigate all of that as a life, that's for me where the Beatitudes come in. That's for me where Yeshua pops up. And the experiences that I'm describing to you, strange as they may sound, but they always sound strange, is a being that actually, it's a glimpse of the thing, not that didn't just make the earth, it made the universe. And so between me and you, I've been sort of rendered speechless. It's taken about 6 months. I haven't ever spoken about this before. We're doing it now. I've been appropriately silent.
Look, well, thank you. And I mean, I guess that silence has been important, because these things are also very personal, and a bit like when you have a dream, it's often best just to kind of try and stay within the dream and carry it with you and see how it continues to unfold in the days after you've had it, especially when you sense it's somehow a big significant dream. And to try and rush in there and analyze it too quickly can completely destroy it.
Yes, you don't want to be continually bursting into tears in public, and there really was a phase that was like that. It's absolutely, you could not ever argue me into Christianity. It's just not possible. You have to encounter, as I said, a presence that is seemingly far bigger than yourself. And I'm sure this is common within Sufis and Hinduism. I'm sure it is, opening to religious experience or spiritual experience across the globe.
So look, you've spoken about it. So forgive me a question then about its meaning, because I don't know, this is just the first kind of reaction. I'm wondering what the association with Jesus, with Christianity might bring, because in a way, you've talked a lot already about injury and suffering, and you know, in the myths you tell, there's often an injury that is required to lead into a wider life. So that is not a new theme for you. You clearly are intensely aware of a power bigger than just your own presence in the world, and have had that for a long, long time. So, you know, I wonder what you feel, can you tell yet what this extra dimension might be bringing, meaning?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can. And as I'm doing this, you will immediately see my sort of historical antecedents in what I'm about to say. I'm going to say to you really what Tolkien said to Lewis, which is, you know, the myths that you love are absolutely filled with the potential of this moment that existed in Galilee for about 33 years, when the myth world exploded into time and space in a fashion that we can all comprehend. So I never saw paganism and Christianity, ironically, as opposed particularly. Of course, there's been all sorts of trouble down the way. In a strange way, for me, Christianity is the fulfillment of all sorts of myths that you see all over the planet. For example, I remember years and years ago, one of the most profound meetings I ever had was with a Lakota Sioux medicine man called Wallace Black Elk. Now, I only met him very briefly. His grandfather wrote Black Elk Speaks, the perennial wisdom book of the Lakota Sioux. But I met Wallace not in any special fashion. I just had a bit of time with him. And the thing that he said immediately was, he said, oh, we all recognized the Jesus stories when they turned up on Turtle Island. We'd met that guy 2,000 years ago ourselves. So I think honestly that the stories that I'm tuned to tell, the myths that have clung and troubled me into communication these last 25 years, have an awful, to be honest, many of the essential deep Christian themes within them. And therefore, I wouldn't have presumed I needed Christianity, which wouldn't have entered my head. It was only when suddenly there's this sort of deep interior announcement that, well, you knocked and now I'm here. What should we do? And I'm just working my way through that, because when I look at a lot of modern Christianity, we seem to have lost our saints, we've lost our monks, we've lost our connection to our bush soul, we've lost the angular, strange, nagging weirdness of Christ. You know, I see him as a thin-skinned, fiery, burning wheel. You know, it's interesting for me that the gospel that really took me in deep was Mark. And of course, Mark doesn't even have a virgin birth in it, doesn't even have the Beatitudes in it. And as you will know, traditionally, it ends not where it ends now, but a little bit back when the women go to try and find Christ, and you know, the rock has been rolled away, and it really ends with roughly, and you know, they were in awe and frightened. And there's something so shamanic about Mark's account that I just found myself unable to see it as just an interesting symbolic field. It felt more like a real-time account. And that took me about a year to digest, that this began to feel like something that might actually have happened.
No, I'll confess to you that when people start talking about Jesus, there's a bit of me just automatically contracts.
Of course.
Because I feel I was sort of there once. It has this kind of cringy feel. And particularly, you mentioned Lewis and Tolkien. Well, Lewis and Barfield talked about these things as well. And I think one of Barfield's sort of ways of protesting against the way that Lewis presented Christianity was that Lewis did agree that the Christ moment was the moment that history and myth met, but it then had a kind of exclusive quality. It's the only place in which history and myth have met. And so if you don't opt into that narrative, you're opting out of Christ, you know, namelessly living elsewhere too, if you like. And Barfield always said, no, no, no. The significance of Christianity is that, what as I've tried to put it, is that we must now all be mystics. The sense of divine perception is not just for the spiritual adept, be they the spiritual elites, you know, in caves up mountains, or indeed, you know, the shaman that has particular access to other worlds. The significance of Christianity was that we can all hope to know the divine within and go on these journeys. And so I'm really, if I first like pull back a bit, I relaxed when you said about Mark's gospel feeling shamanic, because then that, to me at least, takes me to the sense that, you know, Christianity is not, and you said this too actually just now, that Christianity is not about right belief. That's precisely where you started. It's about almost, I don't know, a kind of expectancy that we can be led into more and more. And I think this was Blake's understanding of Christianity, and why, although he was kind of post-Reformation, was a dissenter, not just a Protestant, but that he was a mystic that many other people around him didn't know quite what to make of, particularly Protestant Georgian Christianity in established England. But that he was clear that, well, as he put it, you know, Christ is the divine imagination within us that wants to lead us through various levels of revelation into the divine life, so that we can know that intimately as our own. As you said, you know, that the transcendent is not just out there, but the transcendent is springing and welling up from within us as well. So I'm taking it that you are suggesting this is an opening moment, not a kind of make the right choice moment for you.
No, yes, you're completely correct. And the first thing, my great caveat must be at the moment that I have a big, you know, learner driver thing swinging around my neck. You know, I'm no kind of theologian, and I'm not really interested in punditry or apologetics. I would be no kind of apologist for Christianity, but what I am, I live it. I live in a sort of mystical reality and have done for a long time. And it's getting back to what you just said, which is okay, here it is. Is this an invitation or an imposition? It's an invitation. It's an invitation. And it's the difference again with what I said earlier on. It's not a secret, it's a mystery. It's a mystery that wants to announce itself. You know, whatever Christ is, the way I perceive that being, they're chucking keys into cells, trying to get you out into fresh air, which is actually, funnily enough, that's really an image from Hafez, an old Islamic poet. That's what it's about. It's about a phenomenal baptism. You know, again, we're back to Lewis, a sort of baptism of the imagination that should embolden you and mean that you move with more love and less caution in this world.
That's tremendous, actually, that sense that it brings a genuine freedom, genuine liberty, not am I getting this right? That's another way of putting it.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? It's what I said a minute ago about the 12-year-old kid. We have the encounter, then we, for a moment, we are in touch with some power seemingly bigger than ourselves. And then the institution says, and this is what we think about that encounter. And that's when we're back to religion being a defense against a religious experience. Now, let me please give you an image of something that I went through just 48 hours ago. Actually, I've been trying to figure out, Mark, where in the modern church, where on earth could you put Uncle Martin? Where could you put me? And I have gone to, I've been to a Baptist church, I've been to a Church of England church, I've been to a Catholic. And the wonderful thing about all of them has been that despite the propaganda against them, because people will forgive almost anything other than becoming a Christian, what I've found everywhere is really gracious, kind, invested people. Like, I have had no negative experiences at all. But last Sunday, I walked into an Eastern Orthodox church, and I walked into the Divine Liturgy. And for 2 hours, I walked into a kind of Christian dream that was so deep, it had no beginning and no end. And it was absolutely unlike any form of Christianity I've yet come across. It was as if I walked into the church, and believe it or not, this church is actually it's called St. Pancras of Rome. It's within a shopping centre in Exeter. They built a shopping centre around this Anglo-Saxon church. But I walked in, and as you will know through Orthodoxy, there's no sort of traditional orientation. There's no bullet points. There's no one with a guitar. The priest barely turned round for the first 40 minutes. But it was as if with every 15 minutes that passed, a door through the centuries was opening. And I found in a deep, an almost unimaginably deep way, a contact with, it's an odd phrase, I know, a kind of Christian dreaming. And of course, I had not really thought, again, because I'm a beginner, I've never really thought about Orthodoxy, of course, having some kind of Aboriginal presence in Britain before the Great Schism. It just hadn't sort of entered my head that there would be some grounds. So I have to say, of my recent pursuits, that one is going to be hard to top.
There's so much in what you're saying. I mean, I'm drawn to an Orthodox church, a Greek Orthodox church, which is just up the road from where I am in Camberwell. There's a Greek Orthodox cathedral. And one of the reasons why I like calling by there is because, actually, to go back to your phrase earlier on, I think it is actually an art from eternity, that all these icons, and then of course the ritual as well, can communicate. Maybe that's the significance of the doors opening and closing. It's not just a sort of reaching back across time, it's also a drawing down from elsewhere. And the icons that all have these golden backgrounds, and then the images on the icons step into the room. They don't have that traditional Western perspective. And I think, and also let me draw in something else here as well, because I want to just defend secret a bit as well, because I think that there is a kind of secret which is, you shouldn't know it, it's exclusive. But secret is a good gospel word, not least in Mark's gospel, actually, if I remember right. And what it means there is that this is being presented, it is being offered to you, it is being announced. But to really understand what's going on, you yourself have got to change too. You've got to develop. You've got to sort of die and be reborn. And these themes like what kind of power you're operating with, the role of injury and so on, these all become, very, very significant and important. And so I think what Orthodoxy can get right, which does get lost in other churches, is that it's not about something being done to you, but it's about you being drawn and being invited to, actively change in that drawing as well, so that the secret gradually reveals its mystery, if I could bring the two words together. And that, for me, is what Western Christianity is so much forgotten, particularly since the Reformation. I think you can actually make a case for this in history, that people like Calvin and Luther became very suspicious of inner life. Calvin famously remarks that were, utterly depraved. And so then you can't do the turning inwards that then draws in that which is all around you, which I think was a very standard part of Christianity before the Reformation, in pilgrimages, in festivals, in myth telling, that kind of whole play that stirred the enchanted world up. It gets lost, but Orthodoxy, of course, didn't have the Reformation. And so maybe that's partly what it does to us. It speaks to our participation in all these things, not just something being done for us or to us.
Yes, the last time I'd felt, ironically, like I did at the end of that liturgy was when I was in the Sweat Lodge with Wallace Black Elk 25 years ago. I almost crashed because I went through a red light because I just didn't know what had happened to me. And everyone was shouting at me, and I wound down the window and said, "I've just been to church. I don't know what's going on," and drove off. So for me, it was it was wonderful, but you said something important, I think, that it's not just a kind of a doorway into the past. There's no kind of nostalgia in it. I mean, myth isn't the great secret of myth, that it's not really about a long time ago at all. It's about, you know, a kind of an energy field that is always present. And I think some people would call that, you know, a soulful way of looking at the world. I also like what you said. Yeah, I think there are different gradients to secrecy. I think I have the words Christian and secret bring me out in a rash at the moment, of course, due to all sorts of, you know, scandals we're familiar with. And I sometimes talk about the difference between privacy and secrecy. That we are in a world that seems rather addicted to disclosure at the moment, and sometimes it is good in the way I said to you that I held back for about 6 months so I could talk about some of the things that we're talking about now without sort of becoming, you know, demonstrably overwhelmed by them, that they found a home somewhere.
Yeah. So look, I mean, are they finding a home? How's this going to change things? I've just read your most recent book, Smoke Hole, which is a series of traditional myths, with you reflecting on them, riffing on them. I didn't know that you were going to talk to me about this recent experience before we started just now. Are you beginning to get intimations of, I mean, it sounds like to me you can take the L plates off fairly speedily, because if this is the kind of culmination of a lifetime, bringing together a new chapter, put it like that, you know, what sense have you got of things and what this might mean?
Well, the first thing that's most important is that I am still utterly enraptured and in love with the work I've been building on for decades. I'm not sitting there, you know, chucking my Odyssey and Iliad into the fire as witchcraft. You know, I feel more myself than ever in a way, but the place, the place that I think I genuinely could bring something of what I already know and do into the Christian conversation is actually to do with a very specific area. And it's to do with what I've been calling Celtic wonder tales or Christian wonder tales. Because when I was a kid, the thing that I found very stressful about Christianity was that I believed in it, which was a highly conceptual enterprise, it seemed. I believed in it. I ignored all the kind of ecological vivacity that you find actually in the early Irish stories of saints and beasts. That is you'd have to nuance the animism a bit. Malcolm Guite's very good at that. You'd have to nuance the animism a bit, but these are Christian stories across species. One of my favorite stories at the moment is of a young Peregrini monk. I love the word Peregrini, a Peregrini Christian, because it's got a hawk and a long walk in it. It's perfect. He's carrying the body of Yeshua across Ireland and is overcome by bees. They surround him. And he falls to his knees in rapture and sort of wanders off in this divine state. But when he wakes up, of course, to his horror, he realizes he's no longer carrying the body of Christ. And he goes, oh, bugger, oh no, what have I done? Now, what's happened is the bees have taken the body of Yeshua. They've built a beehive around the body and are now composing little bee services and prayers and liturgies in honor of, you know, of the Galilee Druid. Now, it's a very human thing. The monk is so embarrassed he can't speak of it for a year, what he's done. I've dropped the body of God, you know. But when he finally confesses, an angel appears to him and says, no, this was perfect. It was time for the bees to take over. And what we need you to do is to go back to where you last saw the body, where there's now a bee chapel, and bring Christians to watch how the bees worship your savior. And let the next season of instruction come not from a bishop, but from a bee. That makes me feel good. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories like that. And what I would be really interested in doing is telling them in the old oral tradition, telling them with a drum. And again, not with the emphasis that you believe in them like you believe in an electricity bill, but you just allow them to go into your heart and into your soul and see what happens. So that for me is a place. Breaking news, me and Paul Kingsnorth on November 26th, I think, are going to be, I think it's called Benburb Priory in Northern Ireland, where we're going to do something called The Hidden Country. And we'll talk about, there's two sort of people that are relatively, you know, as I said, new to all of this, but young Christians, you will have seen this, sometimes they have a bit of beginner's luck. They have a brief moment where they have a few interesting things to say, and then they have to do some serious study. And it might be that we've got a bit of beginner's luck. I can't say really, but we're going to gather, and Paul will talk about his work with Christianity and what he calls the machine, and what others have called the machine before him. And I'll be bringing in my work around, in a way, undomesticating Christianity, getting back into the tension and the strangeness of the invitation of Jesus, and also, as I said, bringing, you know, reviving the saints, really reviving these old stories across species.
You see, I think that maybe you're an old Christian rather than a young Christian in a way, because you have the sense of how to bring back these old tales, precisely not for regions of nostalgia, but in order that they may live now, and that feels really significant to me. I mean, you quite often hear this phrase now of people who are Christian curious. They kind of sense that there's something in it. It's a bit, you know, post New Atheists. We had that decade, and we all went a bit into our heads and did the apologetics, which doesn't really work. As you said, and so now we're in a different phase, and with people like you and Paul, who have an ability to speak many languages, how you speak about Christianity, I think, could be really significant. And because I think one of the things about the Christian curious is that what they're actually asking for is something that's about movement, that's about spirit, that's about something that is felt much more than just ascribed to. You know, I think it's got to be about more than the moral as well. This is another one of the regular criticisms I feel of modern, certainly institutional Christianity, is it becomes a kind of moral blast, a moral stance. And the difficulty is, there's a good thing about that, of course, but as William Blake said, the trouble with the moral law is it wastes life, the wastes of the moral law, as he put it, because it so easily becomes a kind of competition between different moral camps as to who's right and wrong. And that then closes down the divine presence, you know, that we all stand before in its myriad ways, you know, be that in the form of the bees, and the ancient stories, or the icons and the divine presence radiating in that way. Yeah, so I'm just, again, thinking on my feet now. I'm wondering whether this is an approach that is going to go for the dynamism and the, you know, well, to draw on from the Romantics again, Barfield, you know, he said that a really important moment in his life, in his younger life, was when he realized he could read poems, not to analyze them or interpret them or understand what they were pointing at, but primarily to follow their energy and just stay with the shimmering felt sense of the words as they danced in his mind in front of him as he spoke them as much as read them. And I'm sure this was William Blake completely understood this. You know, people that try and read one of his epic poems like Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, if you try and read it in your mind on the page, it's a real struggle. You know, the kind of the dynamism of the illustrations help, but if you start to try and speak it out, something else happens then, and it takes you into the living spiritual presence of these things. And I don't know, maybe this is a new phase that we're in now. Who it remains to be seen, because we must discern and be led, not try and conjure too much from our own wills. But I just wonder about, particularly when you say you're linking up with Paul. To do, and Malcolm Guite, you mentioned Malcolm Guite. I mean, Malcolm is a Christian priest and has been in the institution. But again, if you've ever heard him preach, he's a shaman, really. He has endless poetry at his fingertips, and it will come and it will evoke and carry you somewhere as well. It's a very different experience.
Yes. Now, Mark, I know you know Malcolm quite well, but some of our people watching won't. So I just have to advocate for Malcolm for 30 seconds, because this guy, in the last 25 years, I've been exposed to hundreds, if not thousands, of people claiming to be a wordsmith, claiming to understand the oral tradition, claiming to be of a bardic iteration. There is no one like Malcolm Guite in terms of the degree of his absorption in poetry. It is his bread, his beer, his pipe. It is absolutely his way of looking at the world. And the extraordinary integration into Christianity, extraordinary. I was in my cottage a few months ago in the middle of my kind of silence, and there was a storm and all the electricity went. And in the middle of this storm, and I'm just wandering around with a candle, there's a knock at the door, and there's Malcolm Guite with a bottle of whiskey. And he comes in, he sits by the fire, he lights his pipe, he starts to talk, and probably 48 to a day and a half later, our conversation was done. But you are in the presence of a really first-rate mind, a first-rate heart, because he absolutely has the heart of a lion, and he's a complete one-off. I mean, who's like him? And wonderfully at the moment, and I'm thoroughly encouraging him in this because he's tremendous. He is rehydrating a lot of the old Galahad stories from Mallory. And he absolutely is the guy to do it. If anybody wants to know what a modern day bard actually looks like, I mean, I have maybe a dozen poems in my quiver, but not like him.
You do look a bit like him.
Well, I'm the sort of the slightly less weathered version, but he's great. We did a lot of walking, a lot of talking. And I would imagine there must have been periods in his life where he's felt a little lonely, being part of the Anglican Church. And I'm just so glad that he's stuck to his guns. And, we spoke for a couple of days, and at the end, I said to him, will you pray with me? Will you pray? And he can do it. He can do it, in the most lovely way. So anybody's interested, he's all over YouTube, so you can find him there.
Yeah, if you want an introduction to this chap Owen Barfield, then dig out Malcolm's talk on Barfield, and then he's done one on C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and Charles Williams as well, if you want a place to start and begin. But
can I just ask you about you and Barfield, and ask you about your Christian journey? Because am I right in thinking were you initially a priest for a period of time, and then you moved into completely other areas? Although, of course, with psychotherapy, there's all sorts of relationship, but it was Barfield that sort of brought you back into that conversation.
Yeah, I was raised in a Christian household, middling Church of England, and without really a clear sense of direction, strangely, I ended up becoming a priest. Well, actually, let me revise that. I think I was always very passionate about these things, but didn't quite know where else to turn to take that in some direction, take that energy in some direction, apart from being ordained. It's another, I think, problem with modern Christianity is it's a bit of a monocrop. If you're serious about it, then you think about getting ordained, but certainly in the West, there's not many other real options. the minute you asked anyone in the church, they would say lay people matter, and I don't doubt they mean it, but in terms of actually having a path to follow, it's hard to know what else you might do. And anyway, that all fell apart for me when I was ordained. I did what's called a curacy, and I had a breakdown. I got very angry about things, but found my way really searching for a new account of what we're doing, and so went back to the ancient Greeks, and did a PhD actually in the end on Plato, and what that left me with was a profound sense that if you want to know about life, you have to know about yourself. The old dictum, know thyself, and so as to be able to resonate more and more fully with the world around you. And then I realized that modern philosophy is not like that at all. It's very much this kind of objective approach, as if the philosopher doesn't matter at all, completely opposite to the shaman mattering, as we were just saying. And so I ended up doing a psychotherapy training, partly also to try and understand what had been happening to me and put that together in some way. And so it was very much a practice for me. And, it was my initiation experience as well. Even years wondering what on earth I got myself into. But, it did go somewhere. And Barfield then comes in because I wanted to try and make sense of Christianity. And actually, I remember reading this massive tome, A History of Christianity, by Dermot McCulloch, the Oxford professor, wonderful, witty writer, the kind of who's up, who's down approach to Christian history. And but it begins by asking, what are Christians? And he said it's impossible to say, but one way or another, they're all fixated on Jesus. And again, my immediate experience was to shrink, because I thought, I don't know where I belong in that. But Barfield helped me, because what he was able to do, which so influenced Lewis and Tolkien, was tell a story of the significance of Jesus that was also an unfolding of consciousness in our world that we are still very much living in now. And so he tells this story about how in the centuries before Jesus, both in the Hellenistic world and the Jewish world, the Hebrew world, a growing sense that Yahweh, or the divine, the gods, could be known in a monotheistic frame, not just one God amongst many, but somehow a unity that could be felt at the heart of reality. And that then this figure of Jesus becomes known as both human and divine, which means not that he's an exceptional human actually, but that he is fully human. So the invitation becomes to become more and more and more human yourself, with the suffering and the injury and the dying, and that side of things. That becomes the way to know all things, to know the divine. It gave me a kind of Barfieldian equivalent of the Lewis moment, but which felt expansive, that this was a pivotal moment that certainly has a particular way of talking about the shift of consciousness through Christianity, but then it's also possible to see a similar kind of awakening taking place in other traditions as well. So for example, in the Jewish tradition, which of course Jesus was part of, and then Christianity comes out of, but with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, you have a similar inward turn. And so rabbinic Judaism becomes another way of knowing the divine in every detail of life too. And then I think you can even make the move looking at the Indian subcontinent, and the Bhagavad Gita, for example, is reinterpreted by thinkers like Shankara, and again becomes a kind of, it gives rise in that case to what's known as Advaita Vedanta, the idea that there's a unity which lies at the heart of all things, that is our privilege in a way as human beings, not just to share and participate in, as presumably the whole of creation does, but consciously to do so, and so to become part of lifting the whole of creation back towards the divine, the full awareness of that. And so this gave me a way of owning the Christian past that I had, that felt wholehearted, felt sort of full-blooded. And then I think that that Dante was onto this. My most recent book's about Dante, and I tried to look at the Divine Comedy again as a kind of labyrinth that is difficult to get into, but once you find your way into it, every twist and turn, even when it feels like it's moving away, you actually start to see it's just developing your capacity to move to the center. And then I'm working a lot on William Blake now, partly because of being here in South London, you know, near Peckham Rye, where he saw the angels. I kind of thinking, I want to see that too.
Yeah.
I want to know what it's like to be able to share, even in the city, with Jerusalem, with eternity.
Blake was a great comfort for me, because when I was, before the, you know, the thing that really got me started in my early 20s was fasting for 4 days and nights up in Wales, in Snowdonia. And after the rigor and strangeness of that experience, I was back in Brockley. So I was back in South London, and I thought, well, look, if William Blake looks at a thistle and sees a little grey man waving at him, maybe there's hope for me too. So, you know, I'm always interested in what happens to the imagination when it flourishes within a city. I'm a rural figure, you know, I'm rurally tuned. I live on Dartmoor, 365 square miles of wilderness. It's still very possible to get up to your, you know, chest in bog and drown here. But I've had my city moments too. So I, you know, good luck.
Well, my theory about Blake is that, of course, London for him was actually quite a liminal space. You know, you could be in the city, but within half an hour you could walk into the countryside. And I wonder whether it was that to and fro, the contraries, as he put it, that actually was very seminal for him, developing this inner dynamic that could precipitate him into the more and more, could take him to heaven and hell.
Yes. I mean, Blake got out at least once to Sussex, didn't he?
Yeah, so a patron offered him a cottage in Feltham, and he went down there for 3 years, and then he realized that the patron wanted him to do rather traditional things, and that the angels were telling him to do otherwise. Right. And so, yeah, he came back into London, and then, you know, actually disappeared into obscurity even more at that point, but found his mature voice, and so created these the late epics particularly, that I think are really crucial for us now, because look, he's become hugely well known, but so often I tear my hair out if I had any. The religious side, the spiritual impulse gets stripped out of him. You know, he's celebrated as a political figure, he's renowned as a great creative, but to use Blake's phrase, he's often given a kind of Eurozenic reading, as if all that he was interested in was the flat land of the modern world and adding a bit of color. He's quite clear that, you know, if we live in a bounded world, as he puts it, we'll come to loathe it. He's also quite clear that we human beings don't just want more and more, because that leads to a consumptive world. We want it all. We want the divine. And I wonder, but I, you know, clearly hope that that transcendent possibility is at least beginning to bubble up in various places now, because apart from the personal delight in that and the challenge, it feels to me absolutely crucial, if we're not just to consume the flat land of the modern world, with this natural human desire for wanting the all, which can only be satisfied in the divine.
I can't help but think actually that lockdown long term will have probably done a lot of good in that regard. I wrote a lot at the beginning of lockdown where I said, look, could we not see this as a cultural invitation to get to hit the deep interior for a bit? We'll probably never get this opportunity again. So could you imagine if each house was a little hermit's hut and something was fermenting, whether we like it or not? And although the worry amongst my contemporaries was that we would immediately want business as usual again, we want everything to go back to normal, which to a degree is happening, I also encounter more and more and more people wanting a much deeper life and not settling for the rewards that they were getting 3 or 4 years ago. They've had a bit of time. where they've been pulled out of the usual rhythms. And it's funny, you know, when a few of my friends heard about my move into Christianity, they said, "Oh, it's lockdown, he's gone mad." You know, that's the only thing that could have created something this unpleasant in his life. But it isn't that. And I'm encouraged. I was at the Temenos Academy about a month ago. I gave a talk on Christian wonder tales. So I was talking about stories. I was talking about Christian imagination, a revival of the Christian imagination, and telling these old Celtic stories to an audience that had Buddhists, Sikhs, Sufis, Christians, pagans, and the general feeling was, amen, you know, in their own ways and pronunciations, you know, something deep occurred. And it was one of those wonderful evenings. As I was leaving to the door, an old Sufi woman came up and said, "You managed to rehydrate Christianity for me." And that's not even, I didn't even know that was possible. So if you can do that, I'm going to do the same with you know, my old Sufi teaching tales. So that gave me a great warmth in my heart, because to go right back to inhabit the time and genesis of your original home, the old Celtic Christians believed that Eden wasn't just a geographical location. Eden was a form of consciousness. Eden was a place that you could inhabit. And sometimes in life, you meet people that are communicating to you from Eden. And they may have any number of spiritual titles over their head. They could be from any ethnicity you could imagine. It's a presence that announces itself regardless of anything else. And that's something that I haven't lost. I'm always looking, I'm always in any conversation, I'm looking for the one that is communicating from Eden, because it's not me.
Well, we'll wait and see. But again, it reminds me of a you know, crucial insight that Blake had, that it's in the minute particulars that eternity shows itself. It's not in the generalizations, it's not the abstractions. And I think that gatherings like the Temenos Academy, you know, which was hugely influential on me, what they know is that if you plunge yourself into the particular, then the universal shows up. And there's a nice bit of Dante's Divine Comedy in Paradise, when in the heaven of the sun, when Dante and Beatrice encounter the great luminaries. Well, interestingly, not just of Christianity, they meet, for example, the Averroist figure of Sigar of Brabant as well. And what's so wonderful about that is that in life, Brabant had been condemned by Thomas Aquinas, who's also there in the heaven of the sun. And they called each other heretics, you know, which was a serious business in the 14th century, 13th century. But now here in the heaven of the sun, what they realized was that their very difference spoke of their particularity that was such a wonderful focus for the divine light to come into the world. But now they can see the divine light as well as their particular lights and realize that they're sharing in the whole light. So that's a wonderful image for me that I hope speaks of this. Is it cross-fertilization, or is it more catalytic, that when you hear the story in one tradition, it reignites the story, you know, in your indigenous tradition? And that perhaps can be a way of thinking about the encounters between Sufism, you know, the various Indian traditions, Buddhism, of course, as well, and then the old stories from these islands. That this is not about trying to come up with a kind of amalgam, a creed that encompasses it all. We've got to refuse that. We've got to follow the energy and let it start the fires, do the stirring in all, you know, in as many ways as it can.
It was a very late 20th century move, a very kind of hero with 1,000 faces move, to start saying, well, effectively everybody's saying the same thing. No, they're not saying the same thing. Cultures are saying radically different things. There's all kinds of spiritual beliefs. So I think the two things can sort of occur at the same moment. There's the kind of electrical charge of recognition that can happen at an event where spirit has entered. But the way then that is masticated in the mind and the soul of that particular spiritual group can be profoundly different. And I love the difference. I genuinely enjoy the diversity most of the time. Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, you know, and why would it be otherwise? If we're confessing to believe in the one God, that oneness has got to contain all things. And so difference is going to be crucial for understanding that infinity, not just sameness.
Yeah.
Hey, look, thank you for what you've said. You heard it here first. Yeah. And we've talked about a number of people, and I'll try and gather some of those people up and put links below, and also reference to your own work. Where should people go just to check in on that?
Two things. If you really want to be in touch with what's actually happening in my mind right now, subscribe to my Substack post. Every fortnight there's some serious stuff to chew on a Sunday morning. And secondly, I have about 14 books out, and you can find them at something called Sister Mystica. It's not sister like sister with an S. It's oh God, it begins with a C. Sister Mystica, Martin Shaw, online, you'll find it. That's where my books are.
And I'll put the link below. And if you wanted to follow up anything on Barfield, apart from the wonderful Malcolm Guite, I wrote a book called A Secret History of Christianity. Secret in the sense I'm trying to claim it. Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I'll put that. And then, I mean, I've been, written on Dante's Divine Comedy, feeling that that has something crucial for us now. Dante said he wrote for we moderns. He wrote for the future. He wasn't the culmination, I think, of the medieval period. He was precisely the precipitation into a new period. And I have a website as well. But look, Martin, thank you so much.
Bless you.
Cheers for now.
Bye-bye.